Hi, everyone. I'm Iris Constant for GovExec, and I'm excited to welcome you to a webcast on strategic approaches to aligning risk management and compliance for federal financial and regulatory agencies, a webcast in partnership with Maximus. As requirements evolve and financial oversight becomes increasingly complex, federal agencies face growing pressure to manage risk, ensure compliance, and uphold public trust, all while meeting mission critical goals. Navigating these challenges demands more calls for innovative thinking, strategic planning, and the smart use of technology. Joining me today for this topic are Erica Gaddy, Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Chief Risk Officer for the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, U.S. Treasury, and Ron Leidner, Vice President of Client Engagement at Maximus, and a former Senior Technology Advisor, Deputy Commissioner at the IRS. Erica, Ron, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited about today's session.
Me too. And so, Erica, I want to stick with you. Would you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your role, your responsibilities, and how that intersects with today's conversation.
Sure. Okay. As Iris, as you previously stated, I'm the Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Chief Risk Officer here at the Bureau of Fiscal Service. Under my auspices, I'm responsible for budget formulation and execution, internal controls, enterprise risk management, financial management, and audit remediation and audit liaison functions. And so how that intersects with our topic today, I really want to hone in on the enterprise risk management piece, because that is really the function that supports the execution of the fiscal service mission and serves to help us ensure that we enhance public trust.
Amazing. I can't wait to hear more. And now, Ron, I want to pivot to you. Would you please introduce yourself, your role, and your responsibilities and how that intersects with today's discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. So part of my responsibility at the Internal Revenue Service, I was the Deputy Commissioner Senior Technology Advisor. And so when you talk about the technology side of where we're going today, that's all about risk. To Erica's point, it's all about risk. And so I balance the implementation of technology, against risk in business decisions that we were making on behalf of the agency. And so for me, that risk conversation translates across everything that we do in government and in industry. And so I'm excited to be here to share exactly what Erica said, to talk about the risk side of this in the financial space, which is, there are some different nuances of the financial space, but clearly the risk side of it is something that really needs to be, I think, talked about and elevated in conversations.
Amazing. And so let's really dive into that. Let's dive in and talk about risk. Erica, I'm going to turn to you to start. What does your organization's risk management culture look like?
So one of the first things I like to mention when I talk about risk is an acceptable word to say. It's something that you shouldn't be afraid of. It doesn't mean that you've done something wrong because risk exists. Risk is inherent in everything we do, even in the small things in our personal lives, like just getting out of bed in the morning. There is a risk of falling, but it doesn't mean you stay in bed. It means you take precautions, like making sure you're well awake before you get out of bed, and make sure your feet are firmly planted on the floor before you stand up. And so I think that is one of the key things that is critical to an organization's risk culture, is to make people feel comfortable that risk exists and comfortable talking about it, but also making them accountable for mitigating the impact and likelihood of those risks manifesting. And so those are key features that undergird our culture here. And it is an evolution. Not everybody is there with us yet, but we definitely have our senior most leadership on board with really having open discussions about risk. We have a governing body called our risk committee that meets on a monthly basis, and it's comprised of senior executives. And we not only talk about existing risks that we've identified over the years, but we talk about emerging risks, because risk management, you don't need to just look in your rearview mirror. You need to look ahead. And really effective risk management catches risk before they materialize into a risk. So you have conditions that may be brewing. They may not reach the level of an enterprise risk, but you at least need to talk about them, understand them, and watch them. And so that is really the core of our culture and where we're going. And we want to institutionalize that from the top to the bottom of our organization, so that when decisions are made or about where we spend our budgetary resources, or how do we make decisions about our organization and the services we offer to the government, risk needs to be paramount in every conversation, because it inherently exists because we operate. And so that is where we are as a bureau, and we are working to mature and refine that so it is a natural piece of our organization. Like, I love to go to meetings and we are talking about maybe a strategic decision, and should we pursue a certain option? And when someone says, well, let's talk about the risk of this, I get super excited, because I see that that is becoming a regular part, an organic part of our operating model.
Amazing. And I loved the analogy that you opened with at the beginning. That's a great way to contextualize things. And Ron, I know you were nodding along about how it's an evolution, it's an organic process. Do you have anything you'd want to chip in with?
Yeah, I would, and I'm in direct alignment with Erica on this. I think that, you know, when we think of risk, it comes down to three colors: red, yellow, and green. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we have is folks are just afraid of red. They're just really, really afraid of red. It's like, oh my goodness, you know, if there's something that's wrong and I bring it up, you know, I'm gonna, you know, it puts us in a bad place, or they might feel like you're casting shame on someone else, which you're really not doing, because I know in Erica's organization, in the Internal Revenue Service, we have mission goals. And if there's something that's causing one of our mission goals not to be, met, we can't mix the human part of that with the mission goal. And sometimes folks think, if I say something that shows we're anything but green, this is a problem. And I think that's a real challenge, is that folks have just got to be able to objectively bring the risk to say, if this is a risk that could become an issue, Erica said, something about it's okay to talk about risk. I always say bad news doesn't get better with age. And so the earlier that you can identify a risk that could become an issue, the better off you are. And I think culturally, that's something that I know at the Internal Revenue Service we struggle with, but it's absolutely imperative to get into a risk culture where you're absolutely objectively identifying them in the correct color category, if you will, so that they can be acted upon and corrected.
That makes sense. And I did want to kind of pull on a thread there. You mentioned risk culture. I'm assuming that's one of the three pillars here in what makes up a successful enterprise risk management program. Are there any additional pillars that you'd want to highlight, Ron or Erica?
Well, Erica, would you like to go first? Or I can go, either way.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, in my experience, when you look at risk in isolation, many times in many organizations, when you can tell when you're not a risk-aware culture, when what you're doing is making sure that you have a very full risk register. And so in the business space, when people say, well, do you have a risk register? You say, yep, we absolutely do. Folks go, well, then you're good to go, because we're actually checking the box and saying reporting on risk. And that's not a risk-aware culture. A risk-aware culture is to be able to have risk in in collaboration with your business unit and all the responsible units that have to, either address the risk, mitigate it, or inform on it. So it requires close alignment with, with the business organization. In the Internal Revenue Service, we have business operating divisions. And so whenever a risk meeting is conducted, the heads of those offices and the respective responsible and accountable managers are there in the room to hear the risk so that action can be taken upon it. So the business needs to be there, the IT organization needs to be there, the cybersecurity organization needs to be there. All of the organizations that are responsible for delivering the mission need to be present and actively engaged in the organization. So it's not just, a risk body that meets in a governance board meeting so that we can list them all. So I don't know, Erica, if you have anything to add to that, but that's kind of the way I feel about it.
So Ron, I'm in full agreement with you, and I'd like to top you by saying that the foundation of a healthy risk culture begins with education. There needs to be an education component. And so that means making sure that from the bottom up and the top down, everyone understands what risk management is. They understand that no matter where they are in the organization, they have a responsibility for enterprise risk management. And when you give people that responsibility, they take ownership of it. And then you need to explain to them how risk manifests in their individual responsibilities. Like if I'm a security guard in a building, simple example, I have a risk management responsibility because I have to make sure that everyone that comes into the building places their items on the conveyor belt to get x-rayed, and that they have a badge that's present before they are let in the building, and that all protocols pertaining to security are followed. And if they see something suspicious, they need to take the appropriate action. So that's how you have to get kind of brass tacks down into the weeds, making sure people understand where they see themselves in executing enterprise risk management principles. Then I also think, to your point, collaboration across the enterprise is key. And then you really need a enterprise risk management program. And as we talked about, there is a journey. So there is an evolutionary trajectory that these programs need to move forward on from infancy to maturity. And so there needs to be an understanding and an assessment of what a mature enterprise risk management program looks like, and then how to evaluate your own program to see where you are on the maturity continuum. And then where you have work to do, make sure you're consistently closing those gaps so that your program can honestly get to a point of being a mature enterprise risk management program. So that's a self-evaluation, I like to call it. So you do need that self-evaluation, and you need to identify, especially in your strategic planning process, every agency develops a multi-year strategic plan that aligns with the administration's priorities. You need to, in the development of that, also identify what risk exists to you achieving those strategic goals and what actions can be taken to mitigate them, and making sure that you're holding people accountable for the mitigation and that you're reviewing any progress toward mitigation of those activities, and that you allow time to course correct should you need to.
Amazing. And so I want to pull on something that Ron said earlier about how we have this fear of red. We don't want to ever go towards red. How can organizations, or Erica, how does the Bureau of the Fiscal Service balance this need for innovation with the imperative to mitigate risks?
So I'll go ahead and jump in. And so I think that, to Erica's earlier point, you've got to set the culture first and the culture needs to be set to say, the the responsibility of the risk organization is to identify potential things that could impact our mission imperatives. And please understand that we really mean this from a leadership perspective. So it's kind of like the thing that they say at the end of movies: no animals will be harmed in the making of this film, right? So it's pretty much like, you know, please feel free in an open environment to articulate those. Because many times when you can get that done first, then as you're addressing a potential risk or an issue that might come up, you would be surprised as to how new technology comes to those. Because as people go through the process, if they're being open about it, when they're trying to identify a risk, say that there's a potential risk in a database culture, like we have individual databases at the IRS, and at the IRS it would be, well, we can't get to that data at rest. And that's a risk for us because it impacts a significant number of taxpayers. And so when you get the right technical people, when you identify the risk and people start looking into it, they say, well, just a second, you know, we don't have the technology here at the service right now to address this, but there is a particular technology that works because our IT people are saying they evaluated it against the risk and they're advising this. Should we make an investment in that for the good of the service to deliver the mission value? And so I think that it's almost liberating when you're in a very a positive risk program in an environment that allows that. Many times the innovation just comes because you're able to say, here's a problem. And when people are objectively engaged in addressing that problem, the new innovations and technologies just naturally come.
That makes sense. And I do want to pick on you a little bit, Ron, here. Let's talk about technology. How can it help, streamline risk management and compliance processes?
Yeah, so I think that one of the main issues, and Erica, I'd be interested in your perspective on this because this is something that that it's been legacy in government for quite a while. Back in Y2K, when everybody was scared to death about new technology coming in, the government automatically went to their IT organizations and said, we need the IT organization to be responsible for all things technology. And so some agencies have come out of that, okay? Gradually they come out of it, but naturally there's a technology bent to everything we do. And so when risks get identified, one of the reason why I said earlier that we have to have all of the business functions involved in this is because many times when a risk gets identified, people go direct to the IT organization and say, fix this for me technology-wise. And they don't have the perspective of the business. They don't have the perspective of cybersecurity. And many times it slows down actually closing the risk or the issue because they go right to IT and IT, takes care of something and then they bring it to bear and cybersecurity says, that doesn't work for us. It's not compliant with FISMA, it's not compliant with what we have to do. There's a problem here. And so I would say that technology can slow down what we're trying to do to meet our risk and issue goals if there's not that full engagement we talked about earlier. And so the technology is great. It can come in, but the business and the mission goals of the organization have got to dictate how the IT supports, mitigating the risk or the issue.
So I have two perspectives to add to Ron's points on technology. Number one, people often have a problem or a need, and they instantly move to the latest and greatest technological solution. And what that does is it's kind of backwards. You're letting your technology drive your problem instead of your problem driving your technology. And when you do that, you often end up with a solution that doesn't answer the mail, that doesn't satisfy the need. And then you have to go out and re-engineer technology. So before you bring in technology, it's important to really understand what is the need, what is that I have, or what is the problem that I'm trying to solve. And so when you start there and then you avail yourself to assess many technical solutions and really start to understand what will best address your need or solve your problem. And so I think that's important in the risk space, because that's how you mitigate the risk of not having a successful technical implementation or solution. So that's one piece of technology. Then the other piece is technology is going to give you expanded capacity and capabilities. We only can hire so many people. People only have so much knowledge. And so we need to build upon our people by overlaying the technology and integrating it into the processes to help them provide the analysis that technology doesn't provide, and to provide people with real-time information so we can make timely decisions and take timely actions. And so that's where technology plays a large role in risk management, because it can be a mitigant of enterprise risk. It can be a facilitator of identifying risk, and it could help us measure and score our risk much better.
Amazing. And I know, Ron, you were nodding along. Was there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just one quick thing. I mean, Erica brings up a great point. So here's a scenario that happens all too often in any industry, whether it's public or private sector. So at the end of the year, the IT department gets in the latest and greatest application or upgrade to a particular piece of software. And they go ahead and they say, it's brand new, we're going to implement it. They don't bother talking to the business or to the other organizations to find out that when you upgraded that software, I have a custom built application that I did using that software, and it's going to cause everything to crash. And so to Erica's point, when we lead with technology like that for the brightest or newest and shiniest thing, that you've got it, that's the time when you must make sure that everybody's into alignment before you do things like that. So when Erica said that, I'm like, yeah, I can relate to this, because I've seen this happen quite a bit in my experience in the areas that I've led.
It was a lived experience, is what I'm hearing.
Right, it sure was.
And so I know, Erica, you mentioned the issue can sometimes be tech driving the problem, not the problem driving the tech. And I'm assuming data and data analytics will ultimately play a role in this discussion. But how does or how can data help identify or mitigate risks here?
So for the identification of risk, I believe that key risk indicators, which are often supported by data, are really those items that will tell you when something is emerging and when something is an issue. And so, like, maybe, for example, if you have a reserve balance for a particular function you are performing from a financial perspective, and like, say if you have to have a certain amount of cash on hand to make payments, if you know that typically you're spending $1 million a day to make these payments, you should have a risk indicator that shows, oh my goodness, you don't even have enough to make this week's payment. So maybe you want $5 million. These are just, theoretical examples. So say, you know that you need about $5 million a week, $1 million a day. Now that's average. That is not reflective of any spikes or any unusual activity like tax time. You'll be making more payments. When you're making Social Security or benefit or veterans payments, you're going to be having higher amounts. So if you identify what, on average, using data analytics, would you need during certain months of the year, certain days of the year, and certain weeks of the year, you can use those as key risk indicators that says, if my cash falls 20% below this number, I'm in trouble. And so that's a strong data analytic function. Or when you look at your budget execution, if you know that you are 6 months into the fiscal year and you have 6 months left, if you have executed 80% of your funding for a specific function, you might want to get a little concerned because you're spending money quicker, but it might be okay because maybe you spend the bulk of your money in those 6 months, and the last 6 months of the year, you don't spend enough, but you need to have the data to help you know when you should be comfortable with something or when you need to take additional actions. So I think that's where, data analytics is a strong driver because it will help you identify when you're in a situation, when you're approaching a situation that could be potentially risky or detrimental to the mission objectives and goals of your organization.
And Ron, I saw you came off mute. Did you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, so it's everything that Erica said spot on. Here's one of the things that for the Internal Revenue Service, year over year, we always had a going into financial risk that we don't have enough money to execute our operations and maintenance budget. The agency's large, lots of different taxpayer-facing systems, lots of different things we do in terms of the intake, processing, and paying remittances to the American public with BFS's wonderful support. We don't do it without BFS. It doesn't happen without BFS. But every year we would go in and see that potential for financial risk that was there. And so data and analytics would help us because we would be able to go to the business units and say, systemically, are there any underserved systems that we have out there right now that are taxpayer facing, that if we have to make a tough financial decision, we can either reduce the level of service or turn that system off. And so I look at it through a different set of lenses from the business perspective. It's like if we know we have that financial risk at the beginning of the year, if you have good data and analytics, you can go and see, are those systems still active? Are the taxpayers really accessing those systems or not? Are they low volume? If we have to make a tough decision, can we turn off those systems so that we can make sure we can mitigate our financial risk by being able to, reduce the level of service? Now, all that said, that means that you have a mature data and analytics program so you can get to that data at rest. And that's something, in different parts of government that we struggle with, because if getting that data is difficult, if you don't have an analytics system that can give you the right numbers, if you can't run the right reports on it to get the numbers you need to make a business decision, that's problematic. But from a data perspective, if you have access to the data and analytics, it's critical to make the right business decisions, particularly when you're mitigating and dealing with risk and issues.
So we're really building up to my last two questions here. And Ron, you set the stage very nicely for me. We're talking about financial risk. And in the end, for the general public, that can be a very scary word to hear when paired with the government. So how can agencies, use risk to help maintain public trust in their financial oversight efforts, especially when they're managing these $1 million, $5 million big level public funding programs? And
Yes.
I don't know, Erica or Ron, if you want to jump in.
So I will say that leveraging your enterprise risk management program to the fullest extent possible and investing in building that robust risk culture are going to be keys, because the financial risk associated with our operations needs to be properly managed. And so through enterprise risk management, you have the tools, the discipline, and the mechanism to do that management. And I would like to add that in your enterprise risk management practices, you need to have a risk tolerance and a risk appetite, because all risk is not created equal. And there's no organization that can just fully push the necessary resources to enterprise risk management. I don't care if you're a Fortune 500 company, but having risk tolerance and risk appetite help you prioritize which risks are most critical to your organization. And I know I've said two terms that I haven't explained. So when you talk about risk appetite, it really is the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept to achieve a specific goal or objective. And then risk tolerance, it sets the boundaries of risk taking so that your organization will not go beyond a certain amount of risk in pursuit of its long-term objectives. So say, for instance, if you have a human capital risk, and I'm just making something up. So you might have an appetite to take maybe a high level of risk when it comes to human capital. So the decisions you make toward that end, you might be willing to be very bold and daring. However, high is a relative term. High might, if you have scores, it might be between a 20 and a 25, but your risk tolerance is set at 23. That means you're not going to take any actions that's going to put that risk beyond a score of a 23. So even though you have this range for your appetite, your tolerance kind of refines the amount of risk an organization is willing to take. And again, with risk scores, you might qualify them as low, medium, or high, or red, yellow, and green, but the tolerance refines to how red or how high and how low or how green they're going to be. So I think those are really important things for organizations to consider in developing their enterprise risk management programs and making sure that your governing body is on board with that level of risk and that you review it periodically, because there might be conditions that change that may warrant that you take more risk than you typically would have in prior years, or maybe there's less risk that you need to take. So these are not static factors. They're things that evolve and have to be reevaluated when conditions change. And so that mature enterprise risk management program is really going to help support the agency in executing its goals and objectives and making sure that decisions are well-grounded, well-founded, and well-assessed. And that translates into the value that is provided to the citizens of this country.
Amazing. And I love the callback to the red, yellow, and green that Ron just mentioned. Ron, do you have any thoughts on this topic about pairing risk and then having that drive, public trust?
Yeah, so we talked about, a proactive culture, proactive risk culture. So I'm going to use an analogy, okay, and we'll get to the public trust part of this. When Erica talked about risk tolerance and all the things she talked about, that's absolutely spot on. So I'm going to use an analogy, okay? That part is when you go to your doctor and the doctor says, you have cancer, okay? So that's the doctor identified the fact because he's done all of his testing and his analysis that you have cancer. If he stops there, the public trust part never happens. So what you have to do in that scenario, it's like, you've got this affliction, but here's the mitigation plan to get you to better or to the best possible place you can be. And so a big part of this is being able to say, we have fully assessed the risk. It's within our tolerance threshold. Here's where it is. It's a high risk for us, but here's the mitigation plan to get us there. And then as you execute toward that mitigation plan through your risk program, you are continuously advising on the progress you're making toward mitigating that risk. And that's where the trust part comes. When the public can see that you've identified an area that has concern for execution, for the taxpayers or for the public, when you identify the risk through the processes that Erica very articulately talked through, if you leave it there and you don't follow up often with the mitigation, then the public trust will erode. And so you've got to be able to say, here's the problem, here's where I'm trying to go with that problem to mitigate it. And throughout the time, walk them through the progress that you're making toward that mitigation. And that's where trust comes in.
You guys are speaking my language. I love analogies, so I appreciate it whenever someone gives one. In my last question here, guys, I do want to focus on the future or present. However you want to frame this question, feel free to. But what advice would you give to other financial organizations that are really looking to align their risk management and compliance strategies with their mission goal objectives? And Ron, I'll start with you and then close with you, Erica.
So thanks for this. And by the way, I really want to thank you all for the time this afternoon. This has been really enlightening, and I learned a lot from Erica today. So I really appreciate that very much. So I think that you've got to I'll go back to the doctor analogy. You've got to look at the patient first. So in your business area, you have to assess your entire business to say, where are we from a financial perspective? Where are we against our goals? How much capital do I have to invest in this? What are the things I should be focusing on? What are the priorities for the organization? So it's not just let's stand up a risk program today and off we go. Because if you don't have that aligned first, you kind of examine the patient and say, you know what, I really need to take a look at that spot on your left arm, but I don't have the money for it right now, so I can't do that. I'm going to work on the broken leg, if you will. I keep using analogies this afternoon, right? So you've got to assess your entire business first and then decide where you apply your resources to address the things that are the most troubling to you as a business from a risk and issue tolerance perspective. You've got to be able to make sure that you are meeting your mission goals. And the best way to do that is to assess the health of your business first, and then, put in the risk processes and programs and environment that we've been discussing in this forum today.
Amazing. And Erica, same question to you.
So to take it back to the beginning, the strategic goals and objectives or strategic plans that agencies have, they are reflective of the agency's mission and the administration's priorities. So when you have those strategic goals and objectives, you need to take each goal and objective and ask yourself, what organizations and what processes support the achievement of this goal and objective, and what are the risks that exist? And then when you identify the risk to the achievement of your goals and objectives, then you should do some risk scoring and assess a risk tolerance and risk appetite to them. And then if the appetite and tolerance are outside of what you've established, then you have your mitigation plans. And then you identify owners for the risk and the actions in the mitigating plans. And through your governance structure, as Ron talked about, you hold people accountable for implementing those mitigating activities. And then you assess the progress, the mitigation progress, by implementing those actions. And if there's still risk that's outside of the tolerance and appetite, you might need to further mitigate those activities to get them down to an acceptable level. But at the higher strategic level, it gives you that enterprise perspective, because one of the things that can happen if you don't pull everything up to an enterprise perspective, you could have siloed risks. And then you never fully understand the true impact of the totality of those risks on your strategic plan, which includes your missions, goals, and objectives. And that can cause people to be blindsided. It could cause the improper development of mitigating plans. And people could, say, oh, that's a great plan. It is for the risk if you're looking at it from a silo perspective, but across the organization, it is not. And it also gives you the opportunity to synergize mitigating activities, because you might be able to use elements of one mitigating activity to address another risk. So I think it's very important to have an enterprise view in your enterprise risk management, collaboration with people who have equity in those risk and the mitigation activities, doing a level of follow-up and monitoring to make sure the mitigating activities are taking root, being willing to pivot because life happens, the environment changes, and sometimes there might be issues that arise that are out of an organization's control that do impact the risk or create an additional risk. And so it's about being very fluid, but using a well-structured and disciplined enterprise risk management program to support that.
Amazing. I love that. A fluid and well thought out strategy. Now, I do want to thank you both for joining me today. That was Erica Gani, Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Chief Risk Officer for the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, U.S. Treasury. And we were also joined by Ron Leidner, Vice President of Client Engagement at Maximus and former Senior Technology Advisor, Deputy Commissioner at the IRS. Erica, Ron, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me as well.
Amazing. And thank you, the viewer, for watching. Have a great day.